A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headache.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Daniel sent us this one, and it is a deep dive into the very foundation of Israeli society. He wants us to trace the history of what is known as the status quo in Israel, going all the way back to David Ben-Gurion's famous 1947 letter, and looking at how those early institutional choices created the structures that basically define the country today. It is a massive topic, especially given how much these exact agreements are being tested in 2026.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I am actually thrilled Daniel brought this up. Most people talk about the status quo as this vague atmospheric tension between secular and religious Israelis, but it is actually a very specific set of historical documents and legal codifications. It is the architectural blueprint of the state, and like any blueprint from 80 years ago, the building it supports has changed significantly since the first stone was laid. Think of it like trying to run a modern high-speed data center out of a building wired in the 1940s. The fuses are blowing because the load is just too heavy for the original infrastructure.
It is wild to think that a letter written in 1947, before the state even existed, is still the primary reference point for why you cannot get a bus in most cities on a Saturday, or why there is no civil marriage. By the way, fun fact for everyone listening, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash, which is handling our script duties. But back to Ben-Gurion. He was a secular socialist, right? He was not exactly a guy you would expect to be handing over the keys to the rabbinate. He was a man of the plot and the kibbutz, not the shtetl.
That is exactly the paradox. Ben-Gurion was a dyed-in-the-wool secularist, a pragmatist who prioritized state building above almost everything else. To understand why he wrote that letter on June 19, 1947, you have to look at the geopolitical pressure cooker of that moment. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, or UNSCOP, was arriving to decide if a Jewish state was even viable. Ben-Gurion knew that if the religious parties, specifically Agudat Yisrael, went to the UN and said, "We do not want a secular Zionist state," it could have derailed the entire project.
So it was a bribe? Or maybe a more polite word is a strategic concession. Was he worried they would actually testify against the Zionist project to the international community?
Agudat Yisrael at the time represented a significant portion of the Orthodox world that was, at best, ambivalent about political Zionism. If they told UNSCOP that a Jewish state would be a spiritual disaster, it would have given the British and the UN a perfect excuse to say the Jews weren't even unified in wanting a country. He needed a united front. The letter was addressed to the leadership of Agudat Yisrael, and it laid out 4 specific pillars that would define the Jewish character of the future state. These were Shabbat, kashrut, personal status, and education. He was essentially telling the religious leadership, look, we will give you these guarantees if you stand with us at the UN.
Let's break those down, because they are the big 4 of Israeli internal politics. The first one is Shabbat. The letter says the Sabbath would be the official day of rest. That sounds simple enough, but the implementation is where it gets messy. Does that mean everything closes? Or just government offices?
Right, because official day of rest can mean a lot of things. In the 1947 context, it meant that public offices and government-run services would shut down, but it created this immediate tension with personal freedom. Over time, this evolved into the hours of work and rest law in 1951. It is why, to this day, most public transportation in Israel does not run from Friday evening to Saturday night. It's not just about the government taking a nap. It's about the state actively preventing certain services from operating to maintain a national atmosphere of rest.
Except for Haifa. I always found that hilarious. The Haifa exception is such a classic example of how status quo literally means whatever was happening right then stays that way. Because Haifa had public transport on Shabbat before 1948, largely because of its mixed Jewish-Arab population and the British influence, they got to keep it. It is a geographic loophole based on a snapshot of time.
It is a literal grandfather clause. And it shows that the status quo was never a coherent doctrine. It was a ceasefire line. It's like a map of a battlefield where everyone just stopped where they were standing. The second pillar was kashrut, specifically that all government kitchens, including the military, would serve kosher food. This was actually quite practical from Ben-Gurion's perspective. If you want a people's army where everyone serves, you cannot have a situation where a religious soldier literally cannot eat the food in the mess hall.
That makes sense. It is an inclusion move. If the army is not kosher, the religious population is effectively barred from serving or will feel like it is a hostile environment. But how deep does that go? Does it mean the state dictates what private restaurants do or just the state-run ones?
Originally, it was just about the state's kitchen. But over the decades, the chief rabbinate used that foothold to gain a monopoly over the word kosher itself. This led to decades of legal battles where business owners tried to say their food was supervised without using the official state-sanctioned word. But then we get to the third pillar, which is the real lightning rod, personal status, marriage and divorce.
This is the one that still causes the most friction in 2026. Ben-Gurion agreed that matters of marriage and divorce for Jews would remain under the jurisdiction of Orthodox rabbinical courts. His logic was to prevent the division of the House of Israel. He was terrified that if there were two different types of marriage, you would end up with two different Jewish peoples who could not marry each other because of religious law complications like mamzeret or illegitimacy.
Precisely. In Jewish law, if a woman is not properly divorced according to the halakha and has a child with another man, that child is a mamzer and can only marry other mamzerim. Ben-Gurion, the ultimate pragmatist, thought, if I allow civil marriage, half the country won't be able to marry the other half in 2 generations. He viewed it as a national security threat to the unity of the Jewish people.
But the trade-off is that there is no civil marriage in Israel. If you are a secular Israeli and you want to get married, you either go through the Orthodox rabbinate, which many find intrusive or alienating, or you fly to Cyprus and get a civil wedding there, which the state then recognizes. It is this bizarre, expensive workaround that hundreds of thousands of people have to use. It's essentially a marriage tax on the secular middle class.
And it's even harder for the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who aren't considered Jewish by the rabbinate, but came to Israel under the law of return. They are in a legal limbo where they literally cannot get married in their own country. And it is all a direct result of that 1947 letter. The fourth pillar was education, which allowed the religious streams to have their own autonomous school systems. Ben-Gurion basically said, you teach your kids your way, we will teach ours our way, as long as there are some basic national standards.
Basic national standards. That sounds like the core curriculum debate we hear about every single election cycle. Math, English, science. Did Ben-Gurion actually think he could force his curriculum on the Haredi schools?
He thought the state's gravity would eventually pull them in. The problem, as we have seen over the last few decades, is that those national standards have been very difficult to enforce, especially in the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox sector. They took the autonomy and the funding, but they largely ditched the state-mandated subjects.
It feels like Ben-Gurion was making a bet. He was a new Jew guy. He thought that as the state grew and modern Hebrew culture flourished, the ultra-Orthodox would just fade away. He treated them like a museum piece of the old world that would eventually be integrated into the secular Zionist melting pot. He famously said something about the last survivors of a dying world, didn't he?
He did. He saw them as a remnant of the diaspora that would evaporate under the sun of the Galilee. You are referencing the empty wagon philosophy, which is such a crucial piece of this history. In 1952, Ben-Gurion went to visit the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Avraham Yeshaya Karelitz, who was the spiritual leader of the Haredi world. It was this legendary meeting of 2 giants in a small room in Bnei Brak. The rabbi used a Talmudic parable about 2 wagons meeting on a narrow bridge. One wagon is full of goods, and the other is empty. The empty wagon must give way to the full one. In the rabbi's view, the Haredi wagon was full of 3,000 years of Torah and tradition, while the secular Zionist wagon was empty.
And Ben-Gurion, being the cheeky guy he was, countered that the secular wagon was actually full of the mitzvah of building the land, defending the borders, and resurrecting a nation. He argued that without his wagon, the rabbi's wagon would have no bridge to stand on. But the underlying demographic assumption Ben-Gurion had was that his wagon would eventually be the only one left on the bridge. He did not anticipate that the full wagon of the Haredim would not only survive, but undergo a massive demographic explosion.
That is the core of the modern crisis. In 1948, the Haredi population was maybe 2% of the country. They were a tiny, traumatized group of Holocaust survivors. Today, in 2026, they are over 13% and heading towards 16% by 2030. The status quo was designed for a small, fragile minority. It was a protection of rights, agreement for a group that Ben-Gurion thought was on its way out. It was not designed for a massive, politically powerful demographic that holds the balance of power in almost every coalition government.
So, we have the letter in 47. The state is born in 48. And then, in the early 50s, these agreements get turned into actual laws. You mentioned the Rabbinical Court's Jurisdiction Law of 1953. That is when the agreement gets teeth. It becomes the law of the land. But how did it hold up over the next few decades? Because Israel went through some pretty massive shifts, like the 1977 election. Did the status quo change when the right took over?
1977 is the Mahapak, or the upheaval. For the first 29 years of the state, the Labor Party, Ben-Gurion's party, ruled. They maintained the status quo as a way to keep the religious parties in their pocket and out of the way of the real business of the state defense and the economy. But in 77, Menachem Begin and the Likud party won. Begin had a much more traditional, respectful view of Jewish tradition than the socialist old guard. He didn't see the wagon as empty, he saw it as the foundation.
Begin was not religious himself. He famously ate non-kosher food in his younger days, but he understood the soul of the traditional voter. He brought the religious parties into his coalition, not just as add-ons, but as genuine partners. That is when the status quo started to shift from a defensive posture for the religious to an offensive one. It wasn't just about being left alone anymore. It was about shaping the state.
Under Begin and subsequent Likud leaders, the funding for those autonomous religious schools started to grow exponentially. The exemptions from military service, which Ben-Gurion had originally granted to about 400 elite Torah scholars to rebuild the world destroyed in the Holocaust, the Torato Omanuto arrangement, started to balloon. It was no longer a few hundred geniuses. It became a blanket exemption for tens of thousands of young men. It shifted from a scholar's exemption to a sectoral exemption.
This is where the friction really starts to heat up. Secular Israelis looked at the status quo and said, wait, this was supposed to be a limited compromise, not a permanent subsidy for an entire sector that does not serve in the army. This brings us to the 90s, which felt like a decade of legal warfare over these exact issues. The Supreme Court really steps in here, right?
The 90s were defined by the Constitutional Revolution. Aharon Barak, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, spearheaded a movement where the court began to use the Basic Laws, passed in 1992, specifically human dignity and liberty, as a sort of de facto constitution. This allowed the court to start chipping away at the religious monopolies that had been protected by the status quo. They started asking, does this religious monopoly violate the individual rights of the secular citizen?
Like the "who is a Jew" crisis. That seemed to be the peak of the tension.
That is a big one. For decades, the rabbinate decided who was a Jew for the purposes of marriage and the law of return. But the Supreme Court started ruling that the state had to recognize non-Orthodox conversions, like Reform or conservative ones, performed abroad. This was seen by the religious parties as a direct violation of the 1947 agreement. They felt the secular court was tearing up Ben-Gurion's letter. From their perspective, the court was the one changing the status quo, not them.
It is interesting because both sides claim to be defending the status quo. The secular side says, we are defending the status quo of a liberal democracy where people have freedom of conscience, and the religious side says, we are defending the status quo of the Jewish character of the state as promised in 1947. It is like they are reading two different versions of the same book. One sees it as a ceiling, the other as a floor.
And that brings us to the modern era, specifically the last few years leading up to today in 2026. The judicial reform protests of 2023 were, at their heart, a battle over the status quo. The protesters in Tel Aviv were not just fighting about the reasonableness standard or how judges are picked. They were fighting because they feared that if the court was weakened, the religious parties would finally be able to pass laws that would end the status quo once and for all in favor of a more theocratic state. They saw the court as the only thing standing between them and a country where you can't drive on Saturday anywhere.
Right, they were worried about things like a law that would formally exempt all Haredim from the draft forever, or laws that would allow gender segregation in public spaces like parks or government events. It is the fear that the status quo is no longer a balance, but a one-way street toward a more religious society. But what about the religious side? Don't they feel the status quo is being eroded by the secular world?
On the flip side, you have the religious parties who feel that the status quo has already been destroyed by the secular elite. They point to things like the Naim bus program in the Tel Aviv area, where local municipalities have started funding their own weekend transportation because the national government refuses to do it. From their perspective, that is a blatant violation of the Shabbat pillar of the 1947 letter. They see it as secular coercion by the wealthy municipalities.
It is a fascinating workaround. Since the national law bans public transport on Shabbat, these cities just say, okay, we will run a private shuttle service that is free for residents. It is the secular version of a Sabbath elevator. Everyone is finding loopholes in a 79-year-old agreement that no longer fits the reality of the ground. It's like the country is hacking its own legal system just to function.
That is the perfect way to describe it. The Haifa exception has become the Tel Aviv initiative. We are seeing a fragmentation of the state. Instead of one national status quo, we're getting a patchwork. If you live in Bnei Brak, the status quo looks one way. If you live in Herzliya, it looks completely different. We're moving toward a state of Tel Aviv and a state of Judea existing within the same borders.
Let's talk about the draft, though, because that feels like the ultimate unsolvable problem within the status quo. You mentioned Ben-Gurion gave 400 exemptions. Today it is 60,000 or more young men every year who do not serve. In a country that is constantly under security pressure, that inequality of the burden is the most explosive issue in Israeli politics. Why hasn't any government been able to fix this?
It is the third rail. Every time a government tries to pass a law to regulate the draft, the Supreme Court strikes it down for being unconstitutional because it violates the principle of equality. But if the government actually tries to draft the Haredim, the religious parties will topple the coalition instantly. It is a total deadlock. And it all stems from that original 1947 desire to keep the religious sector inside the tent. Ben-Gurion wanted them in the tent, but he didn't realize the tent would eventually be half filled by people who don't want to help hold up the poles.
It is wild that Ben-Gurion's pragmatism created a permanent trap for every prime minister who came after him. He wanted a united front for one weekend in 1947, and now, 80 years later, the country is still paying the bill for that unity. It's a classic case of the temporary solution becoming the permanent problem.
It really highlights the power of path dependency in political science. Once you create an institution or a legal framework, it becomes incredibly hard to change because entire communities build their lives and their expectations around it. The Haredi community has built an entire society based on the idea of the Society of Learners, where the men study Torah and the state provides certain subsidies and exemptions. Their entire economy, their marriage age, their housing market, it's all tied to the status quo. You cannot just flip a switch and change that without causing a Civil War level crisis.
So, what are the actual takeaways here? If someone is looking at Israel today and seeing all these protests and political instability, how does understanding the 1947 letter help them make sense of it? Does it offer a solution or just a diagnosis?
First, it helps you realize that Israel's constitution isn't a single document, but a series of historical compromises. When people talk about defending democracy or preserving the Jewish state, they are often arguing about which part of the 1947 letter they prioritize. It's a conflict between two valid interpretations of the state's DNA.
Second, I think it shows that temporary solutions in politics are almost never temporary. Ben-Gurion thought he was buying time. He ended up selling the future's flexibility. It is a warning to any leader. The pragmatic compromise you make today to get through a crisis might become the unbreakable shackle of your grandchildren. We see this in other countries too. But in Israel, because the stakes are existential, the shackles are made of iron.
That is a great point. And third, it explains why obvious reforms like civil marriage or public transport on Shabbat never happen, even though a majority of the population often says they want them in polls. It is because the status quo is baked into the coalition system. As long as you need religious parties to form a government, the status quo is the price of admission. It's the veto power of the minority that was baked in at the start.
It is a high price, and it feels like the current generation of Israelis is getting tired of paying it. You see more and more grassroots movements that are just ignoring the rabbinate. People are getting private, kosher certifications that do not go through the state, like the Hashgacha Pratit movement. They are getting married in ceremonies that are not legally recognized, but are socially meaningful. They are building a shadow, secular society that operates alongside the official religious structures.
It is a de facto secularization, even if the de jure laws never change. But that creates its own problems, because you end up with a state that does not reflect the reality of its people. It creates a sense of alienation. If you are a citizen and the state tells you that your marriage is not valid or that you cannot move around on your day off, you start to lose that sense of mamlaktiut, or statehood, that Ben-Gurion worked so hard to build. You start to feel like the state is an obstacle rather than a framework.
It is the ultimate irony. Ben-Gurion used the status quo to build mamlaktiut, to bring everyone under one sovereign roof so they could be a unified nation. And now, 80 years later, that same status quo is the thing that is causing the roof to crack and people to move into the backyard.
I think the big question for the next decade is whether the status quo can be renegotiated. Can you have a status quo turbado? Or is the original agreement so foundational that if you pull one thread, the whole tapestry unspools? We are seeing attempts at local status quos, where cities get more power to decide their own character. This is the covenant of the tribes idea that former President Reuven Rivlin used to talk about. That might be the only way forward, a sort of federalism of religious practice.
Like, what happens in Tel Aviv stays in Tel Aviv, and what happens in Jerusalem stays in Jerusalem. It sounds practical, but it also feels like the end of the One Israel dream. It feels like admitting defeat on the idea of a unified national culture.
It might be. But One Israel was always a bit of a myth, or at least a very fragile aspiration. Even in 1947, the letter was an admission that there were two very different visions of what a Jewish state should be. Ben-Gurion just managed to paper over the cracks for a few decades with the sheer force of his personality and the shared trauma of the era.
It is a heavy realization. We are living in the era where the paper is finally peeling off. I look at Ezra, Daniel's son, and I wonder what kind of status quo he is going to grow up with. Is he going to be living in a country where these 1947 rules still apply? Or will there be a new social contract by then? Will he be able to take a train on a Saturday? Or will he be living in a much more religious society than we see today?
If history is any guide, it will probably be some messy, middle-of-the-road compromise that satisfies no one but keeps the country from falling apart. That is the Israeli way. We are the masters of the temporary fix that lasts for a century. We call it muddling through, but in Hebrew there's a certain pride in that flexibility even if it's frustrating.
Well, on that note, I think we have given people a lot to chew on. Understanding the history doesn't necessarily solve the problem, but it sure makes the current headlines make a lot more sense. You cannot understand the 2026 protests or the coalition crises without understanding that 1947 letter. It's the ghost in the machine.
It is the source code of the state. And as any developer knows, if you have bugs in the source code, they only get bigger as the system scales. The 400 scholars bug has scaled into a 60,000 student system crash.
That is a very Daniel-esque analogy. You would appreciate that. So, where do we go from here? Does the status quo survive another 75 years, or are we at the breaking point?
I honestly do not know. The demographic pressure alone makes the current model look unsustainable. If the Haredi community becomes 20 or 25% of the state, the economic and social arrangements of the 1950s simply won't work. The empty wagon won't be able to carry the full wagon anymore, regardless of which one you think is which, because the bridge itself will be under too much weight.
It is a fascinating, high-stakes experiment in national identity. I am glad we got to dig into the roots of it. Thanks to Daniel for sending this one in. It's a topic that really matters, especially for those of us who care about the future of Israel and how a modern democracy balances tradition and liberty.
It is a reminder that history is never really over. It is just waiting for the next generation to deal with the fine print of the agreements their grandparents signed. We are all living in the footnotes of David Ben-Gurion.
Well, that's our deep dive into the status quo. If you found this interesting, or if you have your own take on how the big four pillars should be handled in the modern era, let us know. Is it time to tear up the letter, or is it the only thing keeping the peace?
We've covered a lot of ground today, and I think it's important to recognize that these aren't just dry legal questions. They are about how people live their lives, how they raise their children, and how they define their identity. When you touch the status quo, you're touching people's most deeply held beliefs.
It really is, and it's why these debates get so emotional. You're not just arguing about a bus schedule, you're arguing about the soul of the country and whether it belongs to the past or the future.
Well put. I think we should wrap it there before we get too philosophical.
Good goal. Before we go, a huge thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtoff for keeping the wheels on this wagon turning. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to explore these complex topics with the help of AI.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach more people who enjoy this kind of deep dive exploration. It keeps the wagon moving.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive of over 2,000 episodes, including our earlier discussions on Ben-Gurion and the legal complexities of the region.
See you next time.
Take it easy. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from law.